The Galactic Temporal Council had long considered humans to be the cosmic equivalent of a species trying to understand calculus while still counting on their fingers. Not that the Council was particularly cruel about it. They simply filed humanity under chronologically impaired, handled with condescending patience, and moved on to more pressing matters, like why the Vorthan Empire kept insisting their new time dilation weapons were totally not for conquering anyone. We swear. What the Council failed to appreciate, in their infinite wisdom and finite imagination, was that humans had a peculiar talent for stumbling backwards into brilliance while everyone else was looking the other way. 300 feet beneath the unassuming campus of the Institute for Advanced Neurological Studies in Geneva, Dr. Evelyn Hayes was having what she would later describe as either the worst day of her career, or the day she accidentally broke the universe. The jury was still out on which interpretation would prove more accurate. The laboratory hummed with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested either groundbreaking science or an elaborate government cover-up. Given that it was funded by a combination of 7 different intelligence agencies, and one very confused charity that thought they were supporting research into Alzheimer's prevention, both possibilities remained disturbingly viable. Hayes stood before a wall of monitors displaying brain scans that looked like abstract art designed by someone having a particularly vivid fever dream. Her team of 12 researchers moved between workstations with the focused intensity of people who had long since stopped questioning whether their project made any sense, and had committed fully to seeing where the madness led. The temporal cortex enhancement is showing remarkable stability, announced Dr. Benjamin Park, her lead neuroscientist, while adjusting parameters that would have given any ethics committee nightmares for months. Subject 14 is reporting enhanced memory formation. He paused, frowning at readouts that apparently disagreed with the fundamental laws of physics. But what? Dr. Hayes asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer would be something that belonged in a science fiction novel, rather than a peer-reviewed journal. The memories aren't of past events. They're reporting detailed recollections of things that haven't happened yet. The laboratory fell into the kind of silence typically reserved for moments when someone realizes they've either made a revolutionary discovery or committed an act of accidental scientific terrorism. Hayes examined the data with the expression of someone trying to determine whether they were looking at Nobel Prize material or evidence that they'd all lost their minds. The original project had been elegantly simple in concept and catastrophically complex in execution. The team had theorized that human memory formation could be artificially enhanced by stimulating specific neural pathways with precisely calibrated electromagnetic pulses. The goal was modest: help trauma patients form new positive memories more efficient. What they had apparently accomplished instead was teaching human brains to remember the future, which was either the greatest breakthrough in neuroscience, or a sign that they should have stuck to less ambitious research topics. Show me Subject 14's reports, Hayes said, settling into her chair with the weary resignation of someone who had spent the last 6 months watching their carefully planned research project evolve into something that would make Salvador Dali's dreams seem pedestrian. The subject, a volunteer graduate student who had signed up thinking he'd be helping develop better treatments for depression, had begun reporting memories of events with startling specificity. Not vague premonitions or dreamlike visions, but detailed sensory-rich recollections complete with conversations, environmental details, and emotional context. The only problem was that these memories consistently occurred 24 to 48 hours before the actual events took place. He remembered the fire alarm test yesterday morning at exactly 2:47 p.m. Dr. Park continued, scrolling through data that defied several fundamental assumptions about how time, memory, and consciousness function. Describe the specific pattern of the alarm, the janitor's reaction, even the smell of fresh paint in the hallway. The actual test happened today at 2:47 p.m., exactly as he remembered it. Hayes rubbed her temples, wondering if this was how every great scientific revolution began, with a splitting headache and the growing suspicion that the universe had a twisted sense of humor. The implications were staggering, assuming they weren't all suffering from a collective delusion brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. Has anyone considered, she said slowly, that we might have accidentally created the most elaborate practical joke in the history of neuroscience? Her team exchanged glances that suggested they had indeed considered this possibility and found it disturbingly plausible. After all, they were dealing with a species that had somehow convinced itself that putting pineapple on pizza was acceptable while simultaneously developing technology capable of splitting atoms. Logic had never been humanity's strongest suit. There's more, Park said, because apparently the universe felt that completely rewriting the laws of temporal mechanics wasn't quite enough excitement for one day. Subject 14 is now reporting memories of, well, contact. Contact with what? Non-human intelligence, multiple species actually. And according to his future memories, they're not particularly friendly. Dr. Hayes stared at the data, wondering if this was the moment where she should either call the Nobel Committee or start looking for a nice quiet job in accounting. The readings were consistent. The subject's brain activity showed none of the patterns associated with hallucination or fabrication, and the accuracy of his previous future memories was approaching mathematical impossibility. He remembers being invaded, she asked, because apparently her day wasn't quite surreal enough yet. He remembers humanity losing. The laboratory's gentle hum continued unchanged, indifferent to the fact that its occupants had apparently just stumbled upon either the solution to humanity's greatest challenge, or the preview of its greatest defeat. Hayes looked around at her team, noting their expressions of scientific fascination warring with what appeared to be existential dread. Well, she said finally, with the kind of determined optimism that had gotten humanity through ice ages, plagues, and the invention of social media. I suppose if we're going to accidentally break the laws of physics, we might as well do it properly. None of them noticed the almost invisible monitoring device tucked behind the main server bank, quietly transmitting their conversation to observers who were about to learn that their fundamental assumptions about human capabilities were as outdated as their confidence in their own superiority. After all, the universe had always had a soft spot for underdogs, especially ones too stubborn to realize they were supposed to lose. The volunteer sitting in the neural interface chair looked remarkably calm for someone whose brain was being systematically rewired by technology that existed in the nebulous space between cutting-edge science and probably shouldn't be legal. Graduate student Alex Novak had originally signed up for what he thought would be a straightforward memory enhancement study, the kind that might help him remember where he'd left his keys without having to retrace his steps through half of Geneva. Instead, he found himself at the center of humanity's accidental assault on the fundamental nature of causality itself. How are we feeling, Alex? Dr. Hayes asked, monitoring readouts that suggested his brain was currently experiencing what could only be described as temporal whiplash. Like I've lived through tomorrow already, Alex replied, which would have been dismissed as post-procedure disorientation if not for the fact that his predictions had been achieving an accuracy rate that made weather forecasters weep with envy. 47 light-years away, Commander Nexus, the hegemony observation fleet, was experiencing what his species referred to as incredulous dismay, a unique emotional state that roughly translated to the feeling you get when the beings you've been monitoring for primitive behavior suddenly start doing things that shouldn't be physically. The hegemony had been watching Earth for approximately 3,000 human years, documenting humanity's adorably clumsy attempts at technological development with the kind of patronizing affection typically reserved for pets learning new tricks. Humans built nuclear weapons before mastering interstellar travel, developed social media before understanding basic psychology, and somehow convinced themselves that reality television constituted entertainment. Clearly, they needed supervision. What they didn't need, according to every mathematical model the hegemony possessed, was the ability to access future temporal data streams. Sir, his tactical officer reported with the kind of carefully controlled panic that suggested the universe had just started operating by entirely different rules. The human research facility is displaying readings consistent with Type 4 temporal manipulation. Commander Nexus felt his secondary brainstem, the one responsible for processing impossibilities, begin to overheat. Type 4 temporal manipulation required technology that most civilizations didn't develop until they'd achieved mastery over at least 3 dimensions of spacetime. Humans still thought the speed of light was an insurmountable barrier, and argued about whether climate change was real. That's obviously impossible, he said, though his tone suggested he was beginning to suspect that impossibility had become a surprisingly flexible concept where humans were concerned. Back in the Geneva laboratory, Hayes was discovering that impossible had apparently been redefined as Tuesday, without anyone bothering to update the scientific literature. Alex, can you describe these future memories in more detail? She asked, while her brain quietly started compiling a list of backup career options that didn't involve explaining to the scientific community how she'd accidentally taught humans to time travel with their mind. Alex closed his eyes, his expression shifting to the peculiar concentration of someone trying to remember something that hadn't happened yet. A sentence that would have been pure nonsense 24 hours earlier, but was now simply their new reality. "There's a fleet," he said, his voice carrying the distant quality of someone accessing memories that existed in temporal locations that didn't have proper addresses. "Massive ships, sleek design, definitely not human technology. They arrive on a Tuesday next Tuesday, actually 3:17 a.m. local time. They position themselves in low Earth orbit and begin what I can only describe as a harvest operation." Dr. Park's pen stopped moving across his notepad. Harvest operation. They're not here to conquer in the traditional sense, more like cosmic quality control. They've determined that humanity has developed beyond acceptable parameters for a primitive species and needs to be adjusted. The monitoring equipment registered a spike in neural activity that would have been impressive if it hadn't been completely outside the normal ranges for human brain function. Meanwhile, 47 light-years away, Commander Nexus was staring at readings that suggested the humans weren't just accessing future data. They were somehow remembering it with the kind of clarity typically reserved for lived experience. "This is problematic," he announced to his bridge crew, who had reached the same conclusion, approximately 14 seconds earlier, but were too polite to mention it. Dr. Hayes leaned forward, fighting the urge to check whether someone had slipped hallucinogens into the laboratory's coffee supply. "Alex, in these memories, what happens to humanity? We lose," he said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the outcome of a sporting event, rather than the fate of their entire species. "Not through superior firepower or technology, but because we never see them come. They arrive, begin the harvest, and we're too surprised and unprepared to mount any meaningful resistance. It's over in approximately 6 hours. And you remember this happening, as clearly as I remember my breakfast this morning. More clearly, actually, since the future memories seem to have better resolution than my normal ones." Hayes felt the familiar sensation of standing at the edge of a precipice, except in this case, the precipice was the complete breakdown of linear time, and she appeared to be holding the rope. The logical part of her mind insisted that what they were observing was impossible. The experimental part of her mind whispered that impossible things happened every day in laboratories around the world, usually right before someone won prestigious awards or accidentally destroyed small portions of reality. "Run a full neural mapping sequence," she ordered, because if they were going to accidentally discover time travel, they might as well document it properly. "And someone check the containment protocols. If we're teaching humans to remember the future, we should probably make sure we're the only ones who know about it." What they didn't know was that their containment protocols were roughly as effective as using a screen door on a submarine. The small monitoring device behind the server bank continued its patient surveillance, transmitting data to observers, who were rapidly realizing that their carefully planned timeline for human development had just been thrown out the nearest airlock. Commander Nexus studied the incoming data with the expression of someone who had just discovered that their supposedly predictable laboratory experiment had achieved sentience and was now rewriting its own parameters. "Tactical analysis," he ordered, though he suspected the answer would involve words like unprecedented and theoretically impossible. "Sir, if the humans are actually accessing future temporal data, they now possess advanced knowledge of our intervention strategy. Which means, sir, that we may have accidentally given them the one thing they needed most, time to prepare." In the quiet of the laboratory below Geneva, humanity was being quietly rewritten from the inside out, one impossible memory at a time. And somewhere in the vast cosmic bureaucracy of the Galactic Temporal Council, filing systems were about to require some very significant updates. Within 72 hours of Alex's first coherent future memory, Dr. Hayes's laboratory had transformed from a respectable research facility into what could only be described as ground zero for humanity's most spectacular act of temporal rebellion. The fact that this rebellion was entirely accidental made it no less effective, though it did add a certain chaotic flair that would have impressed military strategists across the galaxy if they hadn't been too busy panicking. The expansion of the program had been inevitable once word spread through the kind of underground scientific networks that thrived on information too dangerous for peer review. Hayes now found herself coordinating with 17 additional research sites across 6 continents, each reporting identical results with the kind of consistency that made statisticians question their fundamental understanding of probability. "We now have 47 subjects experiencing future recall," Dr. Park announced, though his tone suggested he was no longer surprised by numbers that should have been mathematically impossible. "And the convergence rate is approaching unit, which means what, exactly, for those of us who haven't completely abandoned our grip on sanity?" Dr. Hayes asked, reviewing reports that read like collaborative science fiction written by people with disturbingly detailed imaginations. "It means they're all remembering the same future, the same invasion, the same Tuesday morning arrival at 3:17 a.m., the same 6-hour timeline for humanity's defeat, the same harvest protocols that would reduce Earth's population to whatever the aliens considered sustainable management level, even the same weather patterns. Apparently it would be partly cloudy with a light chance of species-wide subjugation." Dr. Hayes had spent the better part of her career studying the chaotic, unpredictable nature of human memory formation. The idea that 47 different people could independently access identical future experiences was roughly equivalent to 47 lottery winners, all picking the same numbers while being struck by lightning during a solar eclipse. Commander Nexus, meanwhile, was experiencing what his medical officers had diagnosed as acute temporal displacement anxiety, a condition previously thought to exist only in theoretical frameworks and badly written science fiction novels. "How many humans now possess future recall capability?" he asked his intelligence officer, though his voice carried the hollow quality of someone who already suspected the answer would be preceded by words like exponentially increasing or completely out of control. "Current estimates suggest the enhancement is spreading through some form of quantum entanglement between neural networks. Approximately 12,000 humans now demonstrate varying degrees of future memory access." Commander Nexus contemplated the career opportunities available to former military officers whose invasion plans had been compromised by the enemy's inexplicable ability to remember being invaded. The list was notably short and primarily consisted of positions in waste management and food service. "And they all remember our arrival." "Sir, they remember everything. Ship configurations, personnel numbers, tactical approaches, even the commander's speech patterns during the harvest announcement." The bridge fell silent except for the gentle hum of technology that was rapidly becoming inadequate for dealing with a species that had apparently decided to rewrite the rules of temporal mechanics through sheer bloody-mindedness. Back on Earth, Dr. Hayes was discovering that managing humanity's first venture into large-scale temporal manipulation was remarkably similar to herding cats. If the cats possessed detailed knowledge of future events and had strong opinions about preventing alien invasion, the subjects are organizing themselves, Dr. Park reported, because apparently their research project had evolved beyond simple memory enhancement and was now approaching something that resembled a psychic resistance movement. They're sharing tactical information through encrypted networks and developing countermeasures based on their collective future memories. "Countermeasures for an invasion that hasn't happened yet," Hayes clarified, because she felt it was important to maintain some connection to the absurdity of their situation. "Technically it has happened, just not in our current temporal position." Hayes wondered if this was how philosophers felt when reality started operating by logic that existed outside traditional frameworks of understanding. The subjects weren't just remembering individual events. They were accessing what appeared to be a complete alternate timeline where humanity had been caught unprepared and systematically defeated. "They remember our weapons being ineffective," Alex explained during his latest debriefing session. "Conventional explosives, electromagnetic pulse weapons, even nuclear devices. The alien ships have some kind of adaptive shielding that reconfigures itself based on incoming attack patterns. But you also remember ways around it." "Not exactly. We remember failing to find ways around it. But now that we remember the failure." He paused, his expression shifting to the peculiar smile of someone who had just realized they were holding the solution to a problem that hadn't been posed yet. "We remember what doesn't work, which means we know what to avoid trying." Hayes felt a curious mixture of pride and terror as she realized that humanity had just accidentally developed the most effective military intelligence gathering system in galactic history. They weren't just predicting the future, They were learning from their own defeat in a timeline that would now never happen. Commander Nexus received the latest intelligence reports with the calm resignation of someone whose carefully planned operation had been transformed into a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating supposedly primitive species. Sir, human military installations are being quietly reinforced with technologies specifically designed to counter our ship configurations, his tactical officer reported. They're developing weapons we've never seen before, but the designs appear to be direct responses to our standard defensive systems. How could they possibly know about our defensive systems? They appear to remember them not working. The commander contemplated the philosophical implications of being defeated by an enemy who had learned from a battle that existed only in a timeline that was rapidly becoming less and less likely to occur. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of paradox that would appeal to human sensibilities. Hayes stood in her laboratory, surrounded by monitors displaying brain scans of people who were busy remembering tomorrow, and realized that humanity had just achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had turned their greatest weakness, their inability to see threats coming, into their greatest strength, by simply refusing to accept linear time as a limitation. How many subjects are we up to now? She asked. Approximately 50,000 and growing exponentially, Dr. Park replied. The neural enhancement appears to be transmissible through some form of quantum resonance. Anyone who spends extended time around enhanced subjects begins developing future recall capabilities themselves. Hayes nodded, watching readouts that suggested her species was in the process of accidentally evolving beyond the traditional constraints of temporal perception. It was, she reflected, exactly the kind of beautiful disaster that humans specialized in creating. Above them, unseen observers were learning that sometimes the most dangerous enemy was one who remembered losing. Tuesday morning, 3:17 a.m. Geneva time, arrived with the punctuality of a Swiss timepiece, and the drama of a species that had spent the previous week remembering its own extinction. The skies above Earth should have been filled with the sleek forms of the Hegemony Harvest Fleet, their adaptive hulls gleaming against the starfield as they began humanity's gentle transition into cosmic irrelevance. Instead, Commander Nexus found himself staring at a planet that appeared to be expecting him. Sir, his communications officer reported with the carefully neutral tone of someone delivering news that contradicted everything they thought they knew about tactical surprise. We're receiving what appears to be a welcome message from Earth. A welcome message. Yes, it's being broadcast on multiple frequencies in 17 different languages, and includes detailed technical specifications for our ship configurations, crew complements, and tactical deployment pattern. Commander Nexus experienced the peculiar sensation of being outmaneuvered by an opponent who had technically already lost the battle they were about to fight. The message concluded with what could only be described as an invitation to discuss terms of mutual non-annihilation over coffee, which was either a diplomatic breakthrough or humanity's way of adding insult to temporal injury. In the Geneva laboratory, Hayes watched global communications networks light up with coordination patterns that would have impressed military strategists if those strategists had been prepared for the sight of a species organizing its defense based on memories of its own defeat. The global enhancement rate has reached approximately 4 million individuals, Dr. Park announced, because apparently their accidental temporal revolution had decided that modest scale was for other species. Military installations worldwide are reporting readiness levels that shouldn't be theoretically possible given the timeline constraints. Hayes nodded, watching satellite feeds of defense preparations that looked less like military exercises, and more like a species that had been quietly planning for this specific Tuesday morning for the better part of a week. Missile systems reconfigured for targeting profiles that matched perfectly with ship designs that shouldn't exist in any human database. Electronic warfare packages calibrated to disrupt communication frequencies that human technology had never encountered. Weapons platforms positioned with the kind of strategic precision that typically required months of intelligence gathering and tactical analysis, all based on memories of losing a battle that was increasingly unlikely to occur. Alex, what are you remembering now? She asked their primary subject, who had become humanity's unofficial temporal weather forecaster. Alex's expression carried the bemused confusion of someone trying to remember something that was simultaneously happening and not happening. The timeline is shift. The invasion memories are becoming less clear, more fragmented, It's like trying to remember a dream that's fading because you're waking up. Commander Nexus, meanwhile, was conducting what military historians would later describe as the most polite retreat in galactic history. His fleet hung in high orbit above a planet whose defensive preparations had somehow been perfectly calibrated to counter every advantage the hegemony possessed. Strategic assessment, he asked his tactical officer, though his tone suggested he was beginning to suspect that strategy had become an obsolete concept when dealing with opponents who remembered the future. Sir, human defensive positions demonstrate complete knowledge of our standard harvest protocol. Their countermeasures are specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in our adaptive shielding that we've never disclosed to any external species. And their weapons, purpose-built for our ship configurations, they appear to have developed entirely new technologies based on detailed knowledge of our defensive capabilities. Commander Nexus contemplated the irony of being defeated by an enemy who had learned from a battle that would now never happen because they had learned from it. It was the kind of temporal paradox that philosophers spent centuries debating, except in this case the paradox was actively shooting at him with weapons that shouldn't exist. Withdraw to minimum safe distance, he ordered, because retreat seemed like the most sensible response to an opponent who had somehow transformed defeat into victory by remembering it in advance. Hayes received confirmation of the fleet's withdrawal through the same military channels that had been frantically coordinating Earth's defense based on memories of its failure. The aliens had arrived exactly as remembered, positioned themselves precisely as predicted, and then apparently realized that fighting an enemy who remembered your entire tactical playbook was roughly equivalent to playing chess against someone who had already seen all your moves. So, Park said, reviewing readouts that suggested humanity had just achieved its first victory in an interstellar conflict by losing it preemptively, we won by remembering that we lost. Apparently, Hayes replied, wondering if this was the kind of victory that would require entirely new categories of military decoration. Though I suspect the philosophical implications are going to give ethicists headaches for decades. Alex removed the neural interface headset with the satisfied expression of someone who had just prevented an apocalypse through the simple expedient of remembering it clearly enough to avoid it. The future memories are stabilizing into a new pattern now, he announced. Instead of invasion and defeat, I'm remembering, well, a very awkward first contact situation, where a confused alien fleet tries to figure out how to diplomatically retreat from a species that somehow knew they were coming. Hayes looked around her laboratory, the same quiet space where they had been attempting to help trauma patients form better memories, and realized they had accidentally rewritten the entire trajectory of human civilization by teaching a few dozen people to remember tomorrow. Commander Nexus filed his mission report with the kind of careful precision typically reserved for documents that would be studied by future generations of military theorists, trying to understand how a supposedly primitive species had achieved victory through the radical strategy of losing first and winning second. The Galactic Temporal Council would spend the next several decades updating their classifications for human temporal capabilities, though they would never quite manage to create a category that adequately described a species that had responded to their first existential threat by accidentally evolving beyond linear time perception in the space of a week. And in the quiet of the laboratory in Geneva, Hayes began planning their next research project, wondering what other supposedly fundamental limitations of human existence might be open to creative reinterpretation. After all, if you could teach people to remember the future, there was really no telling what other impossible things might turn out to be merely inconvenient. The universe, for its part, made a note to be more careful about underestimating species that treated causality as a polite suggestion, rather than an unbreakable law. Some beings, it seemed, were just too stubborn to stay properly defeated, even when they lost.